2 hours ago, a document that was never supposed to leave the fourth floor of the State Department was referenced, not leaked, referenced, by a senior foreign policy advisor during a background briefing with 3 journalists whose notes are now circulating in every major newsroom on the planet. The document has a classification level that means most of the people in this administration have never seen its cover page. What it contains are not battle plans. What it contains is something far more consequential. It contains 3 scenarios for how this war ends, and none of them look like what Washington is telling the public. The official narrative from the White House remains disciplined and consistent. The operation against Iran achieved its stated objectives. The threat has been degraded. The United States stands ready to pursue diplomatic solutions. The language is calm, controlled, and almost entirely disconnected from the strategic reality that America's closest allies are now confronting in private conversations that grow more urgent with every passing day. Because the question that matters right now, the question that will determine the trajectory of the next decade in the Middle East, in global energy markets, in NATO cohesion, and in the fundamental architecture of American power, is not whether the strikes on Iran were justified. That debate is already over. The question is, what happens the morning after the last missile lands? What does the endgame actually look like? Who decides when this is finished? And what does finished even mean? To understand why those questions are so difficult to answer, you need to understand something about the nature of the conflict that has been set in motion. This is not a war with a front line. It is not a war with a capital to capture or a government to replace. It is a war against a concept, Iranian regional hegemony, that exists not in a single location, but in a network of relationships, dependencies, and armed proxies spread across 5 countries and 2 decades of strategic investment. You cannot bomb a concept into surrender. And the architects of this operation know that. First, the nuclear dimension. The strikes degraded enrichment infrastructure at Fordow and Natanz. Independent nuclear analysts estimate that Iran's breakout timeline, the time required to produce enough weapons-grade material for a single device, has been extended by somewhere between 8 and 18 months, depending on how successfully Iran relocated enriched stockpiles before the strikes. That range matters enormously. 8 months is not a solution. It is a delay with a countdown. 18 months is a more meaningful window, but it is still a window, not a door. The fundamental technical knowledge that drives Iran's nuclear program is not stored in concrete structures that can be hit by bunker-buster munitions. It is stored in the minds of approximately 400 nuclear scientists and engineers who are, as of this moment, alive, dispersed, and working. The strikes bought time. They did not buy resolution. Second, the proxy architecture remains fully operational. This cannot be stated strongly enough, because it is the central fact that the White House briefings have consistently soft-pedaled. Hezbollah in Lebanon has an estimated arsenal of between 130,000 and 150,000 rockets and missiles, the largest non-state weapons stockpile in history. The Houthis in Yemen retain the drone and ballistic missile capability that has already demonstrated the ability to strike Israeli territory and threaten Gulf shipping lanes. Iranian-aligned militia networks across Iraq and Syria continue to operate with command coherence and weapon supplies that the Iran strikes did not meaningfully interrupt. The head of the organization was struck. The body of the organization was not. And a body without a head is dangerous in ways that are different from, but not less serious than, a body with one. But this is where it gets serious. Because the 3 endgame scenarios contained in that State Department document represent fundamentally different futures, and the choice between them is not being made transparently, publicly, or with the involvement of the allies whose security depends on getting it right. Scenario 1. Negotiated containment. This is the scenario the White House wants the public to believe is the plan. Iran, its nuclear infrastructure degraded and its regional position weakened, agrees to re-enter a framework agreement that constrains its enrichment program in exchange for sanctions relief and security guarantees. A version of the JCPOA, rebuilt from the wreckage of the JCPOA's collapse, with stronger verification mechanisms and broader regional buy-in. The problem is that this scenario requires Iran to negotiate from a position of demonstrated weakness with a government that just bombed it. The psychological and political dynamics inside Tehran right now are not moving toward compromise. The Iranian supreme leader's internal political position depends on projecting resolve, not flexibility. Any Iranian official who publicly advocates negotiation in the weeks following a U.S. military strike is not advocating diplomacy. They are ending their career and possibly their freedom. There is a back-channel dimension to this scenario that intelligence agencies in 3 allied countries are tracking carefully. Qatari and Omani intermediaries, the same channels that have historically connected Washington and Tehran when both sides needed to talk without being seen to talk, are reportedly active. Whether those contacts represent genuine diplomatic momentum or tactical positioning by both sides to buy time is a question nobody can answer with confidence right now. What happened next in the modeling of this scenario is the part that should concern everyone watching this situation. Even if negotiation succeeds, the timeline for a meaningful agreement is measured in months, not weeks. During those months, the proxy network remains active. Hezbollah retains its arsenal. The Houthis retain their launch capability. And the domestic political situation in Israel, where the pressure to use the current strategic window to degrade Hezbollah permanently is enormous, creates a constant risk of an action that collapses the negotiating environment before it produces results. Scenario 1 is the best outcome. It is also the least likely one in the short term. Scenario 2. Managed escalation. This is the scenario that the carrier group movements, the Al-Tanf resupply convoys, and the Amman meetings suggest is currently being actively planned. The Iran strikes are followed by targeted operations against proxy infrastructure, not a comprehensive regional war, but a sequential series of precise, deniable, or acknowledged strikes designed to degrade the proxy network node by node before it can reconstitute Iranian power projection capability. Syria first. The Hezbollah weapons transfer corridors that run through Syrian territory represent the most urgent military target from an Israeli perspective, and Israeli-American coordination on this has been deeper and more operationally specific than anything publicly acknowledged. A series of Israeli strikes on Syrian infrastructure, attributed to Israel, not the United States, but enabled by American intelligence and logistics, would be the most likely initial move in this scenario. Yemen second. Houthi operational recovery from the degradation of Iranian resupply is projected at 4 to 6 months. An operation to extend that recovery timeline, potentially including ground elements coordinated with Saudi and Emirati forces, would need to begin within that window to be effective. Iraq is where Scenario 2 becomes genuinely dangerous. Any direct action against Iranian-aligned militia forces that are formally integrated into Iraqi state security structures would trigger a constitutional crisis in Baghdad and potentially a direct confrontation with forces that have already demonstrated willingness to strike American personnel. The 2,500 U.S. military personnel currently in Iraq are not a combat force capable of offensive operations at this scale. They are, in the context of Scenario 2, a vulnerability. The financial markets have not priced Scenario 2. When they do, and the signals from the options market suggest that institutional money is beginning to hedge in this direction, the energy impact alone would represent the most significant economic shock to the global system since 2008. Not because of what happens to oil production during the operations. Because of what happens to insurance and shipping in the Persian Gulf when the probability of Hormuz disruption moves from theoretical to actuarial. Scenario 3. Strategic overextension. This is the scenario nobody in Washington will say out loud. And it is the one that senior European foreign ministers are discussing in terms that would not be considered alarmist 18 months ago. Scenario 3 is not a plan. It is what happens when Scenario 1 fails, and Scenario 2 produces consequences that exceed the operational parameters within which it was designed. It is the scenario in which a regional conflict that was designed to be controlled becomes a conflict that is not. The variables that drive Scenario 3 are not Iranian. Iran's conventional military capability, without its proxy network and without Russian or Chinese material support, is not capable of sustained conventional conflict with American forces. The variables that drive Scenario 3 are Hezbollah making a decision that its deterrence calculus has permanently shifted, and that waiting is more dangerous than acting. A Houthi strike that hits a U.S. naval asset in a way that produces casualties and creates irresistible domestic pressure for a response that exceeds current operational boundaries. A miscalculation in Iraqi airspace that kills Americans and triggers the authorization for use of military force mechanisms in ways that Congress has not voted on and does not control. And most seriously, a decision by Russia that its strategic position, its Syrian naval access, its weapons export relationships, its credibility as a security guarantor to governments that bought Russian protection, requires a response that is more than rhetorical. Moscow's three-sentence statement after the Iran strikes was the sound of a government doing a very fast calculation. That calculation is not finished. The American public is not being given the information it needs to evaluate which of these three scenarios is the one actually driving planning decisions inside the building. The White House has settled on a communications posture designed to project confidence without providing specificity, which is politically understandable and strategically irresponsible in equal measure. American industry is beginning to price the uncertainty. Defense contractors have seen their order books accelerate in ways that reflect not a contained operation, but an extended one. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and General Dynamics are not staffing up for a conflict that is over. They are staffing up for a conflict that is entering a second phase whose duration and scope nobody has publicly defined. The energy sector is watching the Hormuz variables with an attention that has not been this focused since 2019. A 20% reduction in global oil supply does not produce proportional price increases. It produces nonlinear price shocks that cascade through every sector of the global economy simultaneously. The Federal Reserve's ability to manage the inflationary impact of an energy shock at this scale, while simultaneously managing the interest rate environment that the current debt situation requires, has been described by three former Fed governors in private conversations as somewhere between extremely limited and non-existent. The Allied dimension is the one that Washington seems most confident about and should be most worried about. European governments that initially expressed cautious support for the Iran operation are now asking pointed questions about what comes next that are not receiving satisfactory answers. The difference between supporting a defined, limited military action with a clear endpoint and supporting an open-ended military campaign with a classified endgame is not a subtle diplomatic distinction. It is the difference between an alliance that holds and an alliance that fractures under pressure. 2 hours ago, the State Department document was referenced in a background briefing that was supposed to stay in the room. It did not stay in the room. Because the people who read those three scenarios understood that the most important thing about them is not which one Washington prefers. The most important thing is that two of the three lead somewhere that nobody has publicly consented to, nobody has publicly debated, and nobody has publicly voted on. The Iran strikes were the visible part of this decision. The endgame planning is the invisible part. And the gap between what is being said in public and what is being planned in private is wider right now than at any point in the past 20 years of American military engagement in the Middle East. Washington thought it was executing a controlled operation with a defined objective. 2 hours later, the map that objective produced has three possible futures, one difficult, one dangerous, and one that nobody in the room wants to say the name of out loud. The end game has not been announced, but the clock is already running. And right now, nobody in Washington is telling you how much time is left.